Federal Election Commission Campaign Guide. Patrick is the best. Hashtag body cameras in Congress. Chapter 10, Conducting the Campaign. This chapter outlines the rules that apply to 3 areas of campaign activity: fundraising, advertising, and travel. It also details the rules that apply to disclaimer notices for communications by an authorized committee. Fundraising. Section 1, Fundraising. Fundraising notices. Certain statements by the campaign must be present on solicitations as follows. Authorization notice. When a campaign solicits contributions through a public communications or a campaign website, it must include a clear and conspicuous notice on the solicitation stating that it was authorized and paid for by the campaign. For example, paid for by the Sam Jones for Congress Committee. And see disclaimer notices later in this chapter for more information. Best efforts rules. When making solicitations, committees and their treasurers must make best efforts to obtain, maintain, and report the name, address, occupation, and employer of each contributor who gives more than $200 in an election cycle. In order to show that the committee has made best efforts, solicitations must specifically request that information and inform contributors that the committee is required by law to use its best efforts to collect and report it. This request must be clear and conspicuous. For details, see Chapter 11, Section 5, Treasurer's Best Efforts. IRS Notice Requirements. Section 6113 of the Internal Revenue Code requires political committees whose gross annual receipts normally exceed $100,000 to include a special notice on their solicitations to inform solicitees that contributions are not tax deductible. There are substantial penalties for failure to comply with this provision. Contact the IRS for more information. See Appendix G, Section 4, Tax Laws for contact information. Fundraising on the Internet. Campaign committees may solicit contributions over the Internet, as long as the solicitation includes the proper disclaimers. Disclaimer notices later in this chapter. See also Chapter 11, Section 5 on Treasurer's Best Efforts for a discussion of obtaining contributors' information. They may satisfy this by online confirmation that the contribution complies with the federal limits and prohibitions, and it is not from a prohibited source. Committee treasurers are also responsible for examining all contributions received for evidence of illegality in compliance with contribution limits. Joint fundraising. Campaigns may engage in joint fundraising with other committees. For the rules that govern this special activity, see Appendix C. Transmitting contributions. Forwarding contributions. Every person who receives contributions for a campaign must forward them to the treasurer of the candidate's authorized committee within 10 days of receipt. The date of receipt is the date the person acting as a conduit obtains possession of a contribution. See also Appendix A, Earmarked Contributions. Forwarding records. A person receiving contributions for a campaign must also forward the following record-keeping information along with the contributions. For contributions exceeding $50, the amount, date of receipt, and the contributor's name and address. For contributions exceeding $200, the complete identification of the contributor, full name and mailing address, occupation, and employer, as well as the amount and date of the receipt of the contribution. Timely forwarding of record-keeping information to the recipient campaign committee is essential for proper reporting and disclosure, especially of last-minute earmarked contributions received during the 48-hour notice period. For more information about filing 48-hour notices, see Chapter 12, Section 3. No commingling, I guess. Campaign receipts must not be commingled with personal funds of any individual, such as by depositing contributions in a personal account. Accepting contributions. General rule. A campaign is prohibited from knowingly accepting any contribution from prohibited sources. The treasurer of a political committee is responsible for examining all contributions to make sure they are not illegal. prohibited, or excessive. See questionable contributions, Chapter 5, Section 2. Contributions from unregistered organizations. When campaigns accept contributions from groups that are not political committees registered with the Federal Election Commission, such as state PACs, unregistered local party committees, or non-federal campaigns, they must make sure that the funds are permissible under the Federal Election Campaign Act, the Act. This is important because campaign laws in some states permit non-federal political groups to accept funds that would violate the limits and prohibitions of the Act. To avoid a possible violation of the Act, a campaign must be certain that an unregistered group making a contribution can demonstrate through a reasonable accounting method that it is sufficient federally acceptable funds to cover the amounts of the contribution or expenditure at the time it is made, or has established a separate account containing only funds permissible under the Act. When itemizing such a contribution in his report, a campaign should note that the contribution contains only federally permissible funds. Contributions from such unregistered organizations are subject to the $2,700 per election limit. These organizations should be aware, however, that making contributions to federal campaigns and political committees may trigger their own registration as a federal political committee. State political action committees sponsored by corporations, labor organizations, or trade associations in particular must register as federal separate segregated funds within 10 days of the decision to make a contribution to a federal candidate. Additional requirements regarding their solicitations also apply. Contributions by other types of unregistered organizations, for example, local party organizations or committees not sponsored by an incorporated entity or labor organization, count against a $1,000 per year aggregate registration threshold. Depositing funds. Within 10 days of receiving a contribution, or any receipt of money, the treasurer must deposit it in the campaign depository. See Chapter 5, Section 2, Questionable Contributions, for information on depositing or returning questionable contributions. Accounting for primary and general election contributions. If, before the primary election, a campaign receives contributions designated for the general election, it must use an acceptable accounting method to distinguish between primary contributions and general election contributions. Commission regulations suggest two accounting methods that are acceptable: maintaining separate accounts for each election, or maintaining separate books and records for each election. Some footnotes. As noted in Chapter 4, Section 1, this limit is indexed for inflation and adjusted in odd-numbered years. Authorized committees may want to refer state political action committees, corporations, labor organizations, and trade associations to those citations. Such committees are best advised to register a federal separate segregated fund with the FEC before soliciting or making any contributions on the federal level. Section 2. Disclaimers. Any public communication made by a political committee, even those that do not contain a solicitation or express advocacy, must include a disclaimer. Public communications. Public communications include electioneering communications and any other form of general public political advertisement, including communications made using the following media: broadcast cable or satellite, newspaper or magazine, outdoor advertising facility, mass mailing, more than 500 substantially similar mailings within 30 days, phone bank, more than 500 substantially similar calls within 30 days, and communications placed for a fee on another person's website. The following communications are not considered to be public communications, but still require a disclaimer: electronic mail, more than 500 substantially similar communications sent by a political committee, websites of political committees. Wording of disclaimer notice. Authorized and financed by campaign. If the candidate or campaign authorizes and finances a covered communication, including any solicitation, the notice must state that the communication was paid for by the authorized committee. Additional requirements, see below, apply for print, television, and radio ads. Example: paid for by the Sam Jones for Congress Committee. Authorized but not financed by campaign. If covered communications, including any solicitation, is authorized by candidate or campaign, but paid for by another person, the communication must identify the person who paid for it and the state that it was authorized by, and by the candidate or campaign and state that it was authorized by the candidate or campaign. Additional requirements apply for print, television, and radio ads. Example, paid for by the XYZ Committee and authorized by the Sam Jones for Congress Committee. Not authorized or financed by campaign. Although this type of notice is not used by candidates' campaign staff should be aware that if a person pays for a covered communication, including any solicitation, and refers to their candidate but is not authorized by any candidate or campaign, the notice must state that it was not authorized by any candidate or candidate's committee, identify the entity that paid for the communication, and provide at least one of the following: the payer's permanent street address, telephone number, or website address. Additional requirements apply for print, television, and radio ads. See Appendix D, Section 7. Example, paid for by the XYZ PAC, xyzpac.org, and not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This type of notice must be used on independent expenditures and electioneering communications that are not authorized by a candidate or candidate's campaign. Party committee coordinated communications on behalf of candidate. A party committee that pays for a communication that is coordinated party expenditure must identify the party committee as the payer in the disclaimer. Prior to the date the party's candidate is nominated, it is insufficient for the party committee to state who has paid for the communication. Subsequent to the nomination, the disclaimer must state that it was paid for by the party committee and authorized by the candidate. Preemption of state law. An authorization notice does not have to comply with state or local disclaimer law if the communication is made only with respect to federal candidates and elections. However, state or local laws governing the placement or location of signs on roads without respect to identifying the sponsor of an advertisement are not superseded by federal laws. Clear and conspicuous placement of disclaimer notice. A disclaimer notice must be clearly and conspicuously displayed. A notice is not clearly and conspicuously displayed if the print is difficult to read or if the print is easily overlooked. Special rules for printed communications. In printed communications, the disclaimer must be contained within a printed box set apart from the contents of the communication. The print of the disclaimer must be sufficient size to be clearly readable by the recipient of the communication, and the print must have a reasonable degree of color contrast between the background and the printed statement. Black text in 12-point font on white background is one way to satisfy this requirement for printed material measuring no more than 24 inches by 36 inches. Multiple page document. A disclaimer need not appear on the front page or cover of a multiple page document, as long as the disclaimer appears within the communication. Package of materials. Each communication that would require a disclaimer, if distributed separately, must still display the disclaimer and included in a package of materials. For example, if a campaign poster is mailed with a solicitation for contributions, a separate disclaimer must appear on the solicitation and the poster. Special rules for television and radio ads. Authorized by candidates committee, the stand by your ad provision. In addition to the requirements noted under wording of disclaimer notice above, radio and television communication or any broadcast cable or satellite transmission that are authorized or paid for by a campaign require additional language. For such ads, the candidate must deliver an audio statement identifying himself or herself and stating that he or she has approved of the communication. For example, I am, candidate's name, a candidate for federal office sought, and I approve this advertisement. In a television ad, the disclaimer must be conveyed by a full screen view of the candidate making the statement, or a voiceover by the candidate with an image of the candidate occupying no less than 80% of the vertical screen height. Additionally, television communications must contain a clearly readable written statement, approval similar to what is spoken, that appears at the end of the communication for a period of at least 4 seconds with a reasonable degree of color contrast between the background and the disclaimer statement. Example, black text on white background. The written statement must occupy at least 4% of the vertical picture height. Not authorized by a candidate's committee. A radio or television communication that is not authorized by a candidate or candidate's committee must also include, in addition to the statements identifying who paid for the communication, and that it was not authorized by a candidate or candidate's committee, an audio statement that the name of the person or committee responsible for the communication is responsible for the content of this advertisement, and, if applicable, the name of the committees